Hey, it's Afro Krieger here, and for this video I've prepared a deep dive on Carl Jung's dream interpretation method, and we will cover absolutely everything: the perspective nature of the psyche, the mechanics of dream interpretation phases, best practices, and I will also give you a few examples. And this video continues my Demystifying Jungian Psychology series, so I'll assume that you understand at least the basics of the shadow integration process, complexes, the psychological types, the animus and anima, and how everything is dependent on the conscious attitude. And if you missed my previous videos, I'll link the playlist over here and also down below. And this whole series is based on my book Pistis Demystifying Jungian Psychology, and you can claim your free copy when you join my newsletter down below. And apologies in advance for the poor audio quality. I'm in the process of moving and had to leave my good mic behind. So let's hope the editor can salvage this one. No pressure. And if you stay, this will definitely be worth it, because no one is teaching this on YouTube. And there's a good mic coming for future videos as well. So learning to analyze dreams is like learning a new idiom. In this case, the metaphorical language of the unconscious. As Jung says, one of the basic principles of analytical psychology is that dream images are to be understood symbolically. That is to say, one must not take them literally, but must surmise a hidden meaning in them. So that said, differently from the conscious mind, the unconscious isn't bound to moral standards and the laws of time and continuity, as it obeys the laws of nature. As we've previously discussed, Jung incorporated both the Freudian and Adlerian perspectives into his psychology. Consequently, when analyzing dreams or any psychological phenomena, we must hold the opposing perspectives, causality and finality. Jung says that in psychological matters, the question, why does it happen, is not necessarily more predictive of results than the other question, to what purpose does it happen? This means we can't interpret unconscious image solely based on causality, that is, seeking to understand the origins or story behind it. This is only half of the equation and often promotes a regressive attitude. Symbols also have a purpose and goal, which reveals the perspective and creative nature of the psyche. And working with the paradox of why and what for is one of the things that make Jungian psychology so unique. Since we understand that in the unconscious lies the embryonic seeds of everything we are yet to become, and the psyche is constantly creating its own future. And I know this may sound complex, but applying it can be quite simple. So let's explore an example. I had a patient who had frequent dreams revolving around the military, and every time he had a visceral reaction of disgust. And, well, this is not a surprise because his father was emotionally absent and worked for the police force. So let's just say they didn't get along well, and he was carrying many wounds from this relationship. Now, interpreting the military symbol through the reductive perspective will take us to his father complex, to his past and all the stories associated with it. And this can be an important step to understand how our internal dynamics were formed and how they are operating. But it's often a dead end. At that moment, he was still living with his mother and was struggling to build discipline and truly commit to finding his own path in life. He was hesitating to become an adult, and the qualities that would help him move further, guess what? Were all present in the military symbol. And there's an interesting thing that happens. When we can only appreciate something negatively, we also can't incorporate the positive traits of it. The military can be seen as hostile, violent, and tyrannical. However, in this case, it was compensating for his lack of attitude, discipline, and seeking to become independent. As the analytical process progressed, his perspective about the military symbol started to shift, and with it, he also experienced changes in the real world. The perspective portion of the military symbol was propelling him to grow and overcome his father complex, and it anticipated a development of his personality. After 2 years of working together, he finally had become independent, disciplined, and committed to his craft. Before, he could only appreciate authority negatively, and this also prevented him from occupying any leadership position. Once he integrated this military symbol by transforming his conscious attitude and making practical changes, he was able to conquer authority over his own life and became a leader in his field. So now let's move to the mechanics of dream interpretation. One thing that we must always have in mind is that the relationship between conscious and unconscious is compensatory and complementary. Also, the conscious attitude acts by selecting, directing, and excluding, and everything that is incompatible with conscious values will either be repressed or simply remain unconscious. And these incompatible contents will form our shadow and are the main material for our dreams, as everything that was forsaken has the purpose of balancing our conscious attitude. And if this process isn't clear to you, I strongly recommend that you check my video on the shadow integration process. Now, Jung says the dream is a spontaneous self-portrayal in symbolic form of the actual situation in the unconscious. In other words, the dream is like a sneak peek into the unconscious, and it helps to envision them as if we were watching a play unfolding in our minds. And in this light, I brought a simple dream analysis structure Jung proposes in volume 8. We have 3 dream phases. The first one is the introduction or exposition, the second, peripeteia or story development, and the third, lysis or lysis, is the culmination or ending. We also have to pay attention to important elements, such as the local or environment and context everything takes place, and the dramatis personae, which are the characters in our dreams. Now, Jung says the first step to analyzing a dream is to establish its context with minute care, and to do so, we must stick as close as possible to the dream images. He explains that pre-association can help us uncover our complexes, but rarely the true meaning of a dream. That's why we must follow a circumambulatory process, that is staying with the symbols and allowing the dream itself to reveal its meaning. So when interpreting dreams, we have to pay close attention to the story that's being told, and it's crucial to dissect the narrative and have clarity on the sequence of events. That said, it's interesting to envision dreams as if they were separated by different acts, and be as thorough as we can with our description, as it helps with turning unconscious contents more vivid. So the first act is the introduction, and we can pair it with describing the local and context that everything takes place. So what is the first thing you remember? How's the environment, and how's the general emotional atmosphere of this dream? The second act is the peripeteia. In other words, what actually happens in the dream. So what adventures or misadventures you are engaged in, and what are the conflicts meant to be solved. And the third and final act is the lysis. And this is the most important one, because it reveals what the dream is compensating for. In other words, in which direction the self's trying to take us in order to establish the right balance again. Once we have the basic structure of a dream, it's time to gather our personal amplifications, aka associations, also sticking to the circumambulatory process. And here it's important to remember that our psyche is structured around 4 different functions. Consequently, psychic images have 4 layers: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. In this light, Marie von Frances, making associations around a theme means plunging it back into the unconscious for a brief moment. The main point is to focus especially on emotional qualities and sensitivity, not definitions. You need to really try to rescue the original richness of what that image conveys. That's why we amplify, and that's the right way to go. Amplifying means going back as far below the threshold as possible and reliving those pervasive emotional ideas, sensations, and reactions we have about something. For instance, let's say there is an important sword in the dream. So what do you think about the sword? What emotions or personal stories are associated with it? What is the material and the design? And how is the sword used? And finally, what is the particular meaning this sword has to you? And we have to follow this process with every single image and character in the dream. And that's why seeking recipes on Google or even AI is just nonsense. The true meaning always lies within and is unraveled by allowing the symbols to affect us. It's only when we are out of personal amplifications that we can look for more collective understandings, such as mythological or archetypal motifs, to enrich our analysis. Jung also explores the notion of relatively fixed symbols, and this means that certain images are closely related to a particular interpretation. For instance, the child tends to symbolize renewal, potential, possibilities, or rebirth. However, this is rather vague. Even though the symbol might bear this meaning, what's important is to understand how this is operating in the individual psyche. The next important step is to understand if these images should be interpreted on the subjective level or the objective level. In other words, when we are supposed to interpret the symbols as a subjective part of ourselves or a concrete relationship with the outer world. For instance, when we see our best friend in the dream, do I interpret it as a part of my personality or as my actual friend in real life? Well, Jung says that in about 90% of cases, dreams should be interpreted on the subjective level, and that objective interpretations only become more frequent when someone is advanced in their individuation process. That said, I find that we often have a mixed interpretation, and this tends to happen when the character in question is close to the dreamer. In this situation, it's important to uncover the projections and, at the same time, find guidance on how to deal with said person. Now, archetypal dreams or big dreams are also rarer, and when we are confronted with images from the collective unconscious, we will frequently need knowledge of mythological motifs. But even though we are dealing with primordial images, it's imperative to understand what role they are playing for a particular person. So, in a sense, the interpretation will also be individual. That said, for the majority of dreams, Jung says we should follow this. The whole dream work is essentially subjective, and the dream is a theater in which the dreamer is himself the scene, the player, the prompter, the producer, the author, the public, and the critic. The simple truth forms the basis for a conception of the dream's meaning, which I have called interpretation on the subjective level. Such an interpretation, as the term implies, conceives all the figures in the dream as personified features of the dreamer's own personality. Continuing the play metaphor, to properly interpret a dream, we have to first understand its story. Right after, we have to gather our personal amplifications of every image and character in the dream, which are personified complexes and archetypes. And in this light, the way we act and the choices we make reveal our deepest psychological tendencies, and also give us insight into how to resolve our conflicts. And lastly, after we gather all this information, it's time to understand what is the dream compensating. For this final part, this is what Jung says. From all this, it should now be clear why I make it a heuristic rule in interpreting a dream to ask myself, what conscious attitude does it compensate? By so doing, I relate the dream as closely as possible to the conscious situation. Indeed, I would even assert that without knowledge of the conscious situation, the dream can never be interpreted with any degree of certainty. Only in the light of this knowledge is it possible to make out whether the unconscious content carries a plus or minus sign. Jung also established that we must work with the premise that we do have an optimum vital point, which occurs when consciousness is that perfect balance between the demands of the outer world or persona and the demands of the inner world or individuation. In that sense, compensation means equilibrating or substituting the conscious attitude by comparing different data or points of view so as to produce an adjustment or rectification. In that sense, Jung brings three possibilities in structures and dynamics of the psyche. First, if the conscious attitude to the life situation is in large degree one-sided, then the dream takes the opposite side. Second, if the conscious has a position fairly near the middle, the dream is satisfied with variations. And third, if the conscious attitude is correct or adequate, then the dream coincides with and emphasizes this tendency, though without forfeiting its peculiar autonomy. And to illustrate all of this, Jung gives us an interesting example in volume 16. So pay close attention to how the interpretation changes depending on the conscious attitude. So first, a young man dreams of a horse jumping over a ravine. Now, his conscious attitude is always hesitant and he's scared to pursue his own path in life. So let's just say he's a poor returnist. So consequently, the dream is telling him to be bold and take risks to conquer his life. After all, the first half of life is meant to seek expansion and strengthen the ego complex. In contrast, a man in his mid-50s has the exact same dream, but he was always courageous and able to conquer his life. In that sense, the dream reveals the origins of his neurosis and highlights that it's time to leave this youthful attitude behind, since in the second half of life, energy must be directed to enrich his inner life. Now, when it comes to integrating the message of a dream, Jung says that it's never a question of this or that, which means we shouldn't be choosing between extremes, but we have to look for a middle ground. Moreover, we should be careful to never destroy someone's conscious attitude and values. because these messages are meant to be incorporated to the conscious personality, not disintegrated. We have to understand that this is a dialectical procedure between our conscious values and judgments and the perspective of the unconscious, and this always requires a moral confrontation and making practical changes. Especially because dreams often exacerbate their contents, to make a point. So we can't blindly follow them. And here's an interesting example. So individuals who tend to avoid conflict and engage in people-pleasing behaviors frequently have dreams in which they're screaming at the top of their lungs at the people who cross their boundaries. If you take this literally, you wouldn't take any responsibility, believe other people are always the problem, and start yelling at everyone the next day. Now, if we follow Jung's method, you'd see these characters as a representation of your own complexes that make you engage with the external world as a people pleaser. Also, you'd apply the questions why and what for, and everything we already discussed about how to deal with complexes. But to keep things simple, in this context, the dream is compensating for a lack of boundaries and assertiveness. So, in that sense, it would be important to understand the exact areas and relationships that require open communication, placing healthy boundaries, committing to learning to better express yourself, and going after what you truly want. Again, integration always requires practical changes. And this ends our exploration of Carl Jung's dream interpretation method. But you can check the rest of this playlist, where I explore the shadow integration process, the psychological types, the animus and anima, and even active imagination. But if you want to dive deep, I invite you to check the Audacity University, where you can master Jung psychology in 1 year, to either become your own analyst or integrate these tools into your professional practice. Now, if you want a simple step-by-step to integrate the shadow, I invite you to check my best-selling and accessible course Katabasis, the Shadow Integration Manual. And lastly, don't forget to claim your copy of my book Pistis, Demystify Jung Psychology. You can find all links in the description. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.